Welcome to Technologies. Oryx Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, with no risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is a cleared, laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, methadone, and opiates. It was the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing in a 2015 National Drug Testing Industry Survey. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. Titled, Why Employers Should Drug Marijuana, it is the second part of a 2-part series. The presentation will be presented by Nina French and Andrew Curran. Nina is principal consultant at the Current Consulting Group and has over 23 years of experience in the screening industry. She specializes in product design, strategy, and business development. Nina works with employers to design forward-thinking screening programs and screening companies to align their products and services to this. She works on all aspects of drug testing and employee screening operations, including SAP and compliance monitoring. Director for Current Consulting Group. His responsibilities include researching state and federal laws, managing the company's online state law database website, and serving as the managing editor of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly, as well as other CCG publications. I will now hear from Nina French and Andrew Curran.
Good afternoon. As Jessica mentioned at the start of the webinar, today is the second part of a 2-part series on marijuana. The first, if you missed it, there is a link to the recording. When you get the copy of the presentation, you'll have that. That was for a month, and it covers what the current landscape for tests is. We're going to do a bit of a recap of that, but if you want details and you missed it, or if you just want a full refresher, the link live in the recording. The second we're going to cover today is a continuation of that. And what we're hoping to do is have you leave this afternoon's session with an understanding of policy, the purpose, and then the practice. So in the first session, we covered the marijuana, the proved risk of harm, solid statistical evidence. We covered that in a good bit of detail, but a refresher, that was one of the key takeaways. It's the you see on the internet is not necessarily true. So some of the headlines today, we look back and we see where did they come from, and we realize that some of the benefits of marijuana that are published have no foundation in fact, or the kernel of fact that has been extrapolated and requoted and republished and sort of become fact, sort of like urban legend. And so make sure that everybody understands from part 1 that you have to be careful when you're setting your company policy or looking at marijuana and testing in the workplace and understanding really what's based on science, solid science, and what's based on less tree findings in science. The other thing is, you know, this seems simple, but again, there's and putting evidence out there that isn't based on fact. But marijuana is harmful to oneself, and we provided that information in detail, statistical information in part 1 of this series. It is harmful to safety and is harmful to the workplace. Today we're going to take what that evidence and those key takeaways from 1, and we're going to try and help you now make this more practical. And that you hear all of this information and digest about as much as you can. And Andrew is going to cover some very detailed information. And understand that you're not going to walk away with an understanding and be able to recite state law and be able to recite case studies. But what we do walk away from is be articulate and communicate a compelling case for continuing to test for marijuana, so that you in your position or your role in your organization are able to comfortably state why you will continue to test and why specifically the arguments and sort of the white noise everyone is saying about marijuana are not necessarily true. I want you to make sure you understand how important policy is as you continue to test for marijuana in the place. And we want to teach you how oral fluid testing plays a really key role in navigating today, but preparing you for the changes that we predict are coming in the near future and then changes that will come in the distant future. Turn over the presentation next to Andrew to cover some little bit of recap and then a little bit of new information on legal marijuana.
If we look here, we have states of recreational marijuana, and assume anything, so just to make everything clear, the difference between recreational and medical marijuana. Obviously, medical marijuana is for medical purposes, but recreational marijuana is just for whatever the person wants to use it for, get up, get down, or anything wants. So we have Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, all recreational marijuana laws where people over a certain age can use marijuana like they use alcohol or recreation. Colorado and Washington became the first two states to legalize recreational marijuana, and that was November 6, 2012, was through popular vote. Followed suit on November 4th, 2014. Again, that was by popular vote. And one flag you won't see on here right now, Washington, D.C. So D.C. did, the Washington, D.C. City Council did approve marijuana, but with the way that U.S. oversees all the laws that get enacted in Washington, D.C., the aspect never put into place because D.C. doesn't have any power to its own law regulation. So, yeah, the legalized recreational marijuana, but the tools and authority to do what they're going to do. So it's in limbo now, but it can change anytime. There are legal challenges and discussions going on that could put D.C. firmly on this list. So, but for Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. in the future, maybe not. That leads to this question: what common before they legalize recreational marijuana? And the answer is they'll legalize medical marijuana first. Each Colorado, Oregon, Washington, D.C., they all have medical marijuana on the books first, and they still do. And that we see for recreational marijuana. And make a little prediction for the future. As we list of states with marijuana laws on the books, all of these. But see here, for example, towards the end of the list, Ohio and Pennsylvania, they have medical marijuana laws this year, Ohio the most recent, and so good at any time one of those. California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada, those four states, official recreational marijuana laws on the ballot. Other states that might join the list: Arizona's got a petition out there with the requisite number of signatures to be voted on this November with some legal challenges. So those might get resolved, and Arizona might join the list of voting in November on recreational marijuana. Maybe not. And there's some other states that have petitions out that may have the right number of votes, may or may not end up on the ballot in November. But we know for sure California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada are going to vote. And if those 4 states pass recreational marijuana laws this November, the number of states will double from 4 to 8 that have recreational marijuana laws. So we see massive change that happen as soon as November, even bigger if a few more other states join the list. So how this develops come November, but this will absolutely be something that radically changes very, very soon. So I'll pass things back to Nina for talking about, again, you said, the more practical aspect and the workplace.
I want to point out that at Carnegie, this is what we do for a living. We don't, like our team at they're creating a product. All of you on the phone are in hiring or another job. This is what we do. So the rest of the laws, and what we do is make this something that becomes very practical for you. I want to say, you don't have to keep abreast of these laws. You want to know this sort of inherently. But sometimes when you do that, you sort of think, I know it, but I don't say why these things are important. So if marijuana is harmful, if states are going to continue to legislate, make it legally available in the United States, you have to do that. What is the impact to that in the workplace? In the workplace, the bottom line is the bottom line, right? You can do 1,000 things, but all that you're doing generally to become successful in the workplace is really the term used in anything that's, not for profit. So think about the impact in the workplace, not only in terms of the list we have here, but think about it in terms of the impact to the bottom line. It's a key component of what job is. So inconsistent work quality. What does that mean? Do some of those translation steps, right? Inconsistent work quality because of marijuana in the workplace means that people are making mistakes. That's impacting your reputation. That's impacting what you do. It can be impacting how much you spend. Poor concentration and lack of focus, the same thing. Now that impacts the quality of work. It impacts the morale of the people around drug users. Lower productivity and erratic work patterns, same thing, right? Increased absenteeism. Increased absenteeism is, sort of has a domino effect. Not does it affect your ability to deliver on time, deliver consistent and quality performance and goods, but it affects morale. It affects costs. You're getting into labor. Distances the job site. Some people think about it in terms of like a construction job site, but if you're in a workplace environment that is office work, think about it. For that one, picturing not just somebody walking out the door, an unexplained absence. Think about it just even using taking coffee breaks or taking smoke breaks. Those things impact what you can get done, and it impacts the overall ability to deliver in a workplace. And some of these others are, less sort of quantifiable, but, the idea that there are errors in judgment, risk taking. You're about the level of cognitive judgment and impairment when using marijuana in the workplace. And there's some disregard for safety of self and others. Doesn't mean that it was purposeful, but, part one, we talked a lot about what is the physical impact of using marijuana and what it does to your cognitive capabilities. And that's where you're going to see that some of that on-the-job and off-the-job accidents happen. Again, purposeful. It is very measurable impact of using drugs in the workplace and using marijuana in the workplace. And then driver accidents, extended lunch periods, and early departures. Again, those are super measurable, easy ways for you to see what the impact on the workplace is. The statistics, specifically, we used one major laboratory marijuana increased 6% nationally. That's a big number. That's a number, and it happened in 1 year. We don't see numbers like that in the United States. Numbers like that. Think back to, the crack epidemic, to the methamphetamine epidemic. This is an epidemic when the number jumped from 6.2% nationally for positive marijuana tests. And look at the second bullet. Andrew mentioned, sort of Colorado and Washington since 2012 being the flagship state for legalized marijuana. And look at the positive drug increases in those two states alone. So when you think back, 4 slides ago, and those 4 flags on that, and we talked about D.C., right? But then remember, we're not really fortune tellers, and we can't see the future. But this one's not super hard to get to. So if we see these jumps, 20% Colorado and 23% in Washington, when states legalize recreational use of marijuana, what do you think you're going to see when some of those other states on that list start to make the same jump? And right now, it isn't a if they do. To a it is a when they do. Something very radically changes. And I'm going to mention, for those of you who are on the phone, this is not just a U.S. workforce issue. This is an international issue. There's legislation, and different terminologies used in different countries, but there's legislation in America. There's legislation in Jamaica, in several different countries for legalizing marijuana. So if you are an international, it's a significant impact across the board, and we'll see that continue to increase too. So what things we know? We know that you're going to see increased marijuana accidents. So you're going to see increased workplace positives. It makes sense. So that the downstream impact of that is increased workers' compensation costs, increased absenteeism, and then when you think back to the slide we just talked about, all of those things that are quote-unquote soft costs or indirect costs, you're also going to see those start to impact the bottom line to the workers, right? So if you're responsible for a P&L, if your bonus or your flexibilization is tied to performance in a department or in a company, it means something. It isn't some philosophical impact. It means something to employers and their bottom line. So all really sort of stand up on your soapbox and say, it makes sense, we're going to continue to test, and yet as an industry and as a country, we keep hearing this question, should still test for marijuana? Right? Can I still test marijuana? Because it's legal, so as an employer, can I? So first talk about the should I. A bit and talk about some can I, but let's talk about should I. A very regular, real, everyday scenario perspective on what we're doing for our evaluating candidates to come and work for us. What we're doing in a pre-employment setting is saying we're going to do our best, and there's a million tools out there, right? There are assessment tests. There are, with big data now, there's a whole lot of information where you can say, what is the idea if I input all of this information about this candidate, the job that we're trying to fill in our organization, what does the match look like? Look like we're a compatible couple. A lot of things that you're doing. Pieces of all of that are important, but combined, you're really trying to make a decision about how good of an employee that candidate is going to be for you. And again, I talked in part one about turnover. Turnover and the cost of turnover is significant. As you move up the chain from entry level to mid-level to senior or very technical positions, that number on the dial changes pretty dramatically too. So you're going from 20% cost of an annual salary to replace a position to executive level where it can be 213% of the annual salary to replace somebody. So what we do is assess the candidate coming in for so that they are a good hire for you long term. And what is drug testing? Drug testing is a component of assessment, right? So the next slide, I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you're getting a drug test for marijuana or a drug test for your full panel as a component of the assessment, considering skipping it, I'll ask you some of these questions. Would you tonight, right? An assessment tool. So you can't everybody, unfortunately interactive, but answer for yourself. Hire somebody who came to the interview intoxicated, over 21 years old, and took him or herself to the interview. They were super sensible, dropped off, and sat down in the interview, and they were clearly intoxicated. Unkempt, like they weren't really prepared, they hadn't done their due diligence, sort of decide that they should get dressed up and show their best face to you. Now you might say, I don't know the answer, but I'm posing these questions to make you think about how testing and how to use is part of a decision into the candidate makes, and you're looking at that drug use is part of an assessment tool that you've got in your toolkit. The bottom ones, would you hire someone with a 6 in heroin positive? If they use it, they didn't use it maybe that day, would you? Or is that one as opposed to marijuana that in part one we showed you had all of these issues and all these costs? So is that better, worse? Mention those things as you look at it. Continue to do. So single data point in the event of your candidate. What positive marijuana tell you? Does it use the drug? Well, 100%, right? Drug test is 100% in the fact that you don't know if the person used it 3 months ago and didn't use it right now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. It tells you they don't use it at all, and that's great. That the candidate just get up long enough to get a job. And whole other training about benefits of a well-rounded drug-free workplace for safety, containing costs, right? But maybe just did their homework and information that's available in the scientific evidence and made a choice to stop using while they were doing their job search. That tells you a little bit about that candidate, right? The candidate research now. Maybe you still don't want them to be a drug user. At least they took the ambition to search and to stop using the drugs. Decisions, right? Because they researched your company, they learned the new drug testing, and they made a conscientious effort to either use or that this job and this workplace is going to be important enough for them to take ownership of it and to not use moving forward. Maybe also tells you that the person has a habit that he or she couldn't stop. And if that's the case, if they couldn't stop it for a pre-employment drug test, there's a really high probability that they're not going to stop it when they're working for you. And that impact slide that we talked about is going to be something that you're dealing with in your workplace from that point on. And the one is, maybe we talked about the soapbox, right? Maybe they want to be the person who goes in and says, look, we're in Colorado, we're in Oregon, and it's legal, and so I'm going to tell you why I believe, both philosophically, medically, that it's really important for us to for me to be able to, use drug testing. And I don't know that you want that either. And the flip side, so why should you continue to test? You should continue to test because care costs are out of control, right? Very expensive. People are becoming more and more self-funded. Employers are becoming more self-funded. And now what we're seeing is providers often looked at your workforce in penetration and the use of the medical benefits. I can remember 15 years ago being very concerned about aging workforce. It was really in the news a lot about aging workforce, the impact of the aging workforce and the baby boomers on health care costs, and employers seeing these significant jumps in the premium. I'm not talking 2%, I'm talking 20 and 30%. And the discussion was around the aging workforce. Well, now drug use is becoming more and more acceptable because it's based on these false information or based on the legalization. We're going to see the health care costs be everything from workers' compensation costs to inpatient rehabs. Those costs, whether self-funded or funded through an insurance company, are going to have a real to the profitability. And then go into the things we've already talked about. So decreased absenteeism, a safer workplace, reduced employee turnover. So those costs of recruiting and replacing an employee start to go down. Increased morale. And then it's that it's an integral part of the candidate and employee assessment, right? So that it helps you use toolbox, part of the thing that you're doing in assessing, determining whether this is going to be a good candidate for your workplace. That's reason to continue to test. Now let's talk about sort of the practical aspects. So if you're saying, I'm convinced, right? So I guess that it's built, some of the information's not correct, but I also get that the high probability that we're going to continue to see legalization in different states throughout the country and in different countries throughout the world. What do you do? Continue to test. Marijuana is under federal law. Legal under federal law. It is a Schedule 1 controlled substance, and it's defined that it has no currently accepted medical use. So, by a doctor. Now, I get that this is a contradictory statement, and I agree there's a big conversation to be had around that as well when we talk about legalization specifically. But it sounds contradictory because we have 24 states or in the states that it's legal for medical use, but it's legally prescribed by a doctor. A little bit about what they being cooked. So we talked about, we know there's going to be legislation short term, but there's going to be something that ends quickly. There is going to be a period over the next 10 or 15 years in the U.S. where we see all of this starting to shake out, and we start to understand where consistencies lie, much like it was stated in D.C., right? They say use it, but then you really can't, right? So how is it legal? How might that be shake out in the next 15 years? But for now, legal under federal law. And so what does that mean? It means that you can choose to test for it, and you can choose not hire. But we got to be really careful about when and when you can't and what your policy has to say. It's an important aspect of this. So when we're talking about workplace, we're just going to give you the two caveats, right? So if you're a federal contractor, if under the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988, if you have DOT employees, then none of the employee that that you're testing for marijuana, and there's no option. So, there's exceptions. The exceptions work in your favor for drug testing. Employees prohibit the possession of marijuana. You prohibit the use and to have negative employment action due to impairment. Like I said, the U.S. DOT requires it, so any other federal required drug testing program is going to require that you test for it. For testing under your own program, you are allowed to discipline or terminate for a violation of the drug and alcohol positive or positive drug test, which should be as a violation of your drug alcohol policy. Positive test should be in your policy as a violation. So, what's this? You make it very clear in your policy about what specific prohibited behaviors are. Drug testing, what you're doing, when you're doing it, how you're doing it. So if you're thinking it's a random test, I don't tell them when I'm doing it. It means you have to tell next Tuesday, we're going to give you a random test. It means that you are going to have in your policy the statement under which conditions you can test, and those categories: pre-employment, reasonable suspicion, post-accident, cause, random. Those things need to be spelled out for the test. You have to spell out what the consequences for policy violations are, and you have to be very clear that you cannot possess or use marijuana in the place, nor under the influence. As we've looked at in recent weeks, and can talk about that a little bit at the very end, but under the influence is difficult because there's no drug test on the science that can specifically equate a positive drug test to under the influence, impaired at that moment. We're going to, when we get to tying oral fluid into this, about how oral fluid can help you get very close to that. But you need to define what influence is in your policy. And that's where you would say a positive drug test in that space. That a detection of any amount is in violation of your company policy. And then you're very specific about the actions rather than the drug test results. So when it comes to reasonable suspicion and you're trying to substantiate what made you do a drug test under a reasonable suspicion or for cause, you want to be very clear that you're looking, the is the outcome, right? It's the lagging measure. You have to do all the right things before you get on the scale for the scale to do the thing you want it to do. When you're substantiating and documenting a reasonable suspicion or for cause drug test, you want behaviors. You want to document the observations that caused you to take the act of giving a reasonable suspicion for cause drug test. So that on that scale, right, when they give the drug test and result, you have the substantiated actions beforehand that caused you to take that reasonable suspicion drug test, to the reasonable suspicion drug test. So sample policy language, and if you should, looking at your policy, we're going to talk about that, but the recognizes that some state laws permit the use of marijuana, either for medical and recreational purposes. The federal government continues to classify marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance, making it illegal for any purpose under federal law. So it's an acknowledgement that we know, we didn't miss it, we know that it's legal for recreational or medical use, but we're doing to follow the federal law. And specifically, you want the policy language to list the prohibited conduct. So employees prohibited from being under the influence of marijuana while at work or on company time as exhibited by a positive drug test. So that's where we talked about positive drug test is important, specifically stating that the positive drug test is going to be part of your prohibited conduct language. And really specifically that you cannot possess it in the workplace, that you can bongs, rolling papers, things that specifically marijuana-related paraphernalia. You can't bring them to work. You can't have them in your desk. You can't have them on lunch break. You can't during off time or official work schedule, period. You want to list those things in your policy. And then you want to be specific as to the consequences. You know, again, this isn't a conversation specifically a policy, but it's very important that you say what will happen. So employees who test positive for marijuana, regardless of the reason for use or the source from which the employee acquired the drug. In other words, if you have a medical card, the doctor said it's okay for Nina to use this. We're not going to worry how you got it. It's still a violation in this policy, and it's subject to the adverse employment action as outlined in the consequences section. Okay. So, what are the takeaways regarding policy? If you're mandated by the federal government, it's a must. If you're mandated by a state government, if there's mandatory state drug testing laws in your state, then you must test marijuana. There's none that specifically prohibits marijuana, so you're most likely required to test for marijuana. If you are in a state without legal marijuana, the other won't affect you or apply to you. Even state, if there's pending legislation, obviously until it's done, it doesn't do. If you've got multiple states where legal laws are not required to adopt a legal standard from another state. So that federal prohibition. If where medical law exists, and make sure you're in compliance with it. So you want to be prepared. You're with having a policy that follows federal testing. What you don't want to do is have a challenge with it and not remember the basis. So you want to be, again, conversant and understand what the state laws are. It's still okay with the basis of where you're located. Is illegal and you're following that federal law. And then lastly, if you're employer with Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, or D.C., Washington, D.C., you still comply with those DOT regulations. It doesn't matter. So here's a minute and pause. And we're both going to talk to you a little bit about the role of lab-based oral fluid drug testing. And we did throughout the presentation about how it can help you. And help you no matter what type of employer you are. So some employers are very risk averse. It is culture, and they are very strict and risk averse. Other companies say, you know what, we're a little looser. We're comfortable with a higher level of risk. We're going to oral fluid really solves no matter fall on that spectrum. Andrew, I'm going to pass this over to you to cover a couple slides here, a new voice, and then I'll join back on to talk about some more information on how oral fluid fits.
So here are some factors to consider and to keep in mind. No medical or recreational prohibits drug testing. In fact, not a single one even says the word drug testing, which that seem to directly affect drug testing, but none of them even actually say the word drug testing. So it's not by any marijuana out there. The original medical marijuana laws were somewhat ambiguous about employers, employees, and marijuana and the workplace. But many recent medical marijuana laws have become much more explicit about how employers are supposed to treat employees who use medical marijuana, are medical marijuana users. And so, for example, of a medical marijuana law that seems to discourage employers, or seems like it's putting closing the book, so to speak, on drug-free work policies and drug testing for marijuana. So, case we're going to look at right now is Pennsylvania, which we mentioned earlier is one of the recent states to pass a medical marijuana bill. So it's one of the most, just the newest laws on medical marijuana. So it expressly prohibits employer discrimination when it says, in the law, quote, may discharge, threaten, refuse to hire, or otherwise discriminate or retaliate against an employee regarding an employee's compensation, terms, conditions, location, or privileges solely on the basis of such employee's status as an individual who is certified to use medical paragraph, but it's just one sentence. So that means this is chock full of legal talk. Actually, what it's saying is an employer cannot discriminate against an employee because he has a medical marijuana card in their pocket or they're on the list at state approved distribution center for marijuana to get it for medical purposes. And so, oh, okay, book closed. Discrimination against marijuana in the workplace. But that's what that's saying. What's there is about an employee because he or she is a registered medical marijuana user. Basically, you can't pick on one person or people in your workplace just because of a certain type of medicine they're taking. Actually, what that discrimination clause is all about. So it's not getting workplace policies or drug testing at all. And if we look at another citation from the same law, it says this, quote, this shall in no way limit an employer's ability to discipline an employee for the influence of medical marijuana in the workplace or for working while under the influence of medical marijuana when the conduct falls below the standard of care normally accepted for this position. Another long one sentence. And so expressly giving employers permission to disciplining employees for working under the influence of marijuana or for medical marijuana on the workplace. Essentially, it's expressly saying that you can go ahead and keep enforcing and implementing drug-free workplace policies and include drug testing. It doesn't say you can't, and it's actually saying that an employer has every right to keep creating substances out of their workplace. Add that one line at the bottom when it falls below the standard of care normally accepted for this position. It seemed to be limiting, but in reality, in the drug testing industry, we call that reasonable suspicion, reasonable cause to test, which actually just makes the testing even more legally defensible, legally safe, because discriminating them for having that medical marijuana card in their pocket, and you're not discriminating them because you think they might be smoking on the weekend, and you're not doing anything at all. You're actually conduct that indicates to you that there is some sort of impairment going on. Nina said there's no drug test that quantifiably says and is impaired at work. It observes me with slurred speech, slow reactions, and other things that can impair ability. And there's this reasonable suspicion of marijuana use, and there's a drug test. Well, then there's going on because we've set up our observed conduct that shows that this reduced standard of work that they're impaired, actually, and we've observed it and seen it. So marijuana law contains this strong language protecting medical marijuana users, our certified users, but it expressly permits employers to discipline for marijuana use or in the workplace. And in Pennsylvania, you don't have carte blanche to go and do whatever you want about substandard conduct, but no one has carte blanche in any state to do anything. So this actually isn't that distressing. So the law specifically allows employers to discipline, so we just have to have the balancing act with reasonable suspicion, that observed conduct, and then drug testing comes and that balance. And so apply elsewhere, and I'm going to pass this back to Nina to talk about that.
Okay. So we're going to wrap up here and start to tie it together. And we're going to tie it together with lab-based oral fluids. So everybody who's on this call, having gone through 1 and 2, you're now an hour and 45 minutes into sort of learning why it's important to still test, and why it's important to learn that you can still test, and how you can communicate to your boss, to your coworkers, and to your employees test, and why it's important to the company and the bottom line to test. We're going to talk about how oral fluid drug testing to do that. So about how a well-worded policy is critical. It is what keeps you from paying your bills, right? Have a great policy and be specific. With the policy, that oral fluid drug testing is it gives a layer of protection against accusations and claims for discrimination. We're going to talk about why. Now, you have to know, it doesn't mean you have to. But I've been in this industry for 25 years and dealt with employers from, 2 to 200,000 employees. It fits, and it fits in a number of ways. So testing for marijuana adds layers of confidence. We talk about why. I know I'm not telling you why yet. Blood testing is costly, right? So I can count on 2 hands the number of companies that I know who do blood testing unless it's a requirement in totality. That thing that is seen as probably, I think, the most invasive. Hair testing, many companies think is also invasive. It really sort of depends on people's personal preference to some degree. A great window, a broad window. It all tends to be the single most expensive drug test methodology, maybe neck and neck a little bit with blood testing. And then testing shows use, but it shows use from a while ago. And this is where I see some questions coming in about OSHA, and we're going to talk about that for a minute. But this is where you're looking at your program overall and to think about how could I today insert oral fluid drug testing to my program. Oral fluid drug testing, I'm not a scientist, right? So I can't have a scientific conversation. But I can show you some interesting things about the science of oral fluid drug testing and the importance of it in the workplace. So the window of detection for oral drug testing is something that you want to become familiar with. One of the things that oral fluid drug testing does, it allows you to almost immediate look at drug use. So hair testing, we've done this and we'll get to it, but hair testing shows you when it metabolizes. You don't have to be a scientist, right? It's going to take a little bit of time for the drug that goes into your system to come out in your hair. And testing is not used for things like post-accident or reasonable suspicion because it's simply not going to show. Look at the lines on this slide for oral fluid and blood. Right? It's within minutes. It's short after use. So when you're looking at a post-accident and reasonable suspicion setting, it starts to tell you a story about immediate use. Again, say that impaired necessarily, but it's an awfully close tie. When you look at, you've got to wait hours, and so that is a challenge when you're starting to talk about things like closer detection. But when we talk about pre-employment, so it seems to be a compelling argument for post-accident and reasonable suspicion, but they start to talk about, and you think, well, there's a couple things. So the closer use, back to the question, would you hire somebody who is sitting in front of you who is intoxicated? Well, the use detection of oral fluid drug testing, you're looking across from somebody who smoked a joint in the parking lot either, right? So it tells you that very near-term use. But to think of, well, if the detection is shorter, am I getting that assessment tool I want from employment? So you might say, well, I'm going to just do oral fluid testing for accident and reasonable suspicion. And what I'm saying to you is, attention to the next slide, when you're looking at the window of detection and the positivity rates. And this goes back to where we started in the very beginning, which is rely on the team at OraSure, rely on the information from vetted statistics to in your program. So the window of detection for marijuana in oral fluid is shorter than for urine. When you look at the overall positivity rates, overall, you'll see that they are very similar. When you look for marijuana, it's greater. So, like, how is that possible? You just told me it's shorter. The with detection sort of combated by surprise. So, oral fluid drug testing is a donor self-collected, super observed drug test, right? You are immediately upon for employment telling the person to do observing them doing the collection. During testing, the act of coordinating the site, you notify them they've got to go on the locator and find out where to go to be collected and how to be collected. There's very often a delay, and employers are often challenged by how to limit the delay. Tell them they have to go have a drug test and when they go get the drug test, because I'm worried that they're at GNC, or I'm worried that they're at the local head shop and they're trying to figure out ways to get out of that drug test, to adulterate the drug test. Well, oral fluid drug testing is extraordinarily difficult, if not, I'm not going to say the word impossible, but very difficult, right, for education, and it right away. So that, or the 24 hours or that weekend, because there's no available and open collection site for a urine collection, that detection of urine where it's slightly longer, it goes an assessment tool. You still get the value of your full panel of drug tests. You're able to use it as that piece in your toolkit that says, yeah, I think this person's a good match for me. But you're very able and effectively to be clear, you're taking a closer tie to recent use. And I think that's very important in both of the cases, because you're starting to look at things like the judgment. Is it something that's a habit and the person couldn't quit, or is this accident likely tied to recent use? Was the person sort of under the influence, or can I get closer? I'm going to take a quick minute and talk a little bit about POCT, which is sort of, depending who you are on the phone, it's instant drug testing. And I'm just going to really go to the very bottom bullet here, which is look at statistics on the detection for using POCT. There are issues of being a non-FDA cleared device, and most instant oral testing devices are FDA cleared, and there are significant issues with that in terms of being using a non-FDA cleared device in the workplace. So, another conversation, but we can talk about that. But really look at the statistics available. The higher cutoff levels for CT devices are going to significantly impact whether you see any positives. And that takes you to that idea of testing at all for marijuana. And when you're using an oral fluid POCT testing device, that assessment tool, assessment tool in a way. So just pay very close attention and look at the statistics if you wanted to consider that, because it's a very different technology and a very different type of testing than lab-based oral fluid testing. And we saw one question on OSHA, and we took it today. But most of you know who are affected by OSHA that they had new regulations that are very broad, sweeping regulations specifically related to record keeping. And in a 295-page regulatory document, there are 10 pages in the preamble that specifically address impairment, the role of your policy and your post-accident and reasonable suspicion. They specifically say, actually, in the regulations under OSHA that you should use a drug test that shows impairment. And we've already said that that technology exists. They've delayed the effective date of OSHA ability to cite employers from August 10th to November 1st. And mainly that is because of a very lawsuit that was brought by the American Builders Association and several other employers and associations saying that OSHA has overstepped. And so, but I'll tell you this, that a non-retaliatory post-accident policy, that you have a blanket policy statement. So looking at your post-accident under OSHA, you say if somebody got a bee sting and attention, there's a high likelihood that drugs were not a contributory factor. So a post-accident drug test may not be warranted. When other types of accidents in the workplace, they want you to try and tie it as closely as you can to observable behaviors that we've been talking about all day, and that, make this statement of make it closer to impairment, but you talked about with lab drug testing, that window of detection and the detection of, the immediate detection of use. You can use oral fluid very effectively for your OSHA employees. Show that you understand the rule, that you are using all of the technology available to you today to comply with the OSHA regulations. Now, even though we know we're going to get more information from OSHA on regulations to clarify. But I'll again, wrapping up that, not if you have state laws, OSHA doesn't apply. If you have voluntary state laws, it doesn't apply. And if you have a drug-free workplace that you're following, OSHA doesn't apply. So slide on what is a very long topic, but we just did want to talk about that a little bit today since it is so pressing in a lot of people's minds. So in conclusion, there's a lot of information. You're going to get the recording. You're going to get both slides to review it. But what's important for you to remember is that it's legal to continue to test for marijuana. It's, like I say, a moral judgment, right? It is an assessment tool. Drug testing is an assessment tool. It is a decision as an you're acting as an aid for your business. And so testing program should reflect that. And you want to see that your program and your policies and your procedures have support your role in cost reduction, improving workplace morale, productivity, and safety. Strong is going to be very, very in doing that. That sterile regulations don't prohibit it, but that all drug testing fits the bill. Looking at these overreaching issues of marijuana and legalized marijuana, it puts you ahead of the curve. And we looked at the curve, right? The curve is coming. We know it's not anywhere. So as legislation continues to pass in these states, oral fluid, lab-based oral fluid drug testing has to prepare now for what we predict in the future. And that, again, remember the guidelines are going to allow oral fluid drug testing for DOT, believe, in the very near future. And, it's government, so in the 18 to 24 months. And so, again, that's another thing that if you tend to be risk averse and you like to follow the standards, DOT standards will likely include oral fluid, lab-based oral fluid drug testing in the near future. And so you're not that idea by starting to prepare and look at lab-based oral fluid now. And so what should you do? You're walking away, you spent 2 hours, and you invested your time in educating yourself. So some of the things you can do is look at your policy, make sure it's reviewed, make sure it's updated to adequately cover legalized marijuana. And while you're doing that, make sure that you include the ability to use lab-based oral fluid in your drug testing program now. We can't put that into your SAMHSA policy yet, but can put it into your policy for any of your other workplace testing. With your representative, cost analysis, because one thing we did not cover in detail is the ability to use and to eliminate fluctuating costs. Again, another conversation, but oral fluid is a very easy way to help you budget the drug testing program, and I know that's an important cost factor for employers. And then finally, oral fluid, or your OraSure representative for information on helping with that cost analysis, policy piece in, and how you can look at starting a pilot program or starting to use oral fluid drug testing in your workplace now. Few questions. I think we answered them regarding the OSHA policy and some of the increases, but we will follow up with that. And any other questions since we're out of time. And Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you to
and Andrew for that information. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope that you found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. This is the second part of a two-part series. If you've not viewed part 1 or you would like to review part 1, that link will be included in the follow-up email as well. Thank you for your attendance today, and this concludes today's webinar.